I knew HR had no intention of helping me the moment I watched the director slide my third harassment report into a folder without reading past the first page, offer me a rehearsed smile, and say, "Sometimes misunderstandings happen in high-pressure workplaces, Claire." For 7 months, I documented everything: late-night messages from a senior manager, inappropriate comments during meetings, witnesses who suddenly stopped returning my calls after speaking with HR, and emails that somehow disappeared from official records. Every time I followed procedure, the answer was another delay, another investigation that quietly closed, another reminder that I should focus on my career instead of creating conflict. What made it worse was knowing they expected me to quit. I could see it in the way conversations stopped when I entered conference rooms and how promotions passed me by while people whispered that I was difficult. So I stayed calm. I kept copies of everything. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, an unfamiliar calendar invitation appeared in my inbox. The subject line was only 6 words long. Mandatory Executive Compliance Review Meeting. My manager received it. HR received it. The people I had reported received it. And for the first time in months, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. They looked nervous. My name is Claire Bennett, and I was 28 years old when I learned that some companies don't protect their employees, they protect the people who make them money. I worked as a senior operations coordinator for a rapidly growing logistics firm outside Chicago, a job I had spent nearly 5 years earning through long hours, weekend projects, and a reputation for solving problems without creating them. The trouble started in March when Daniel Mercer, a regional vice president with a polished smile and a habit of treating rules like suggestions, began directing unwanted attention toward me during meetings and after-hours events. At first, I convinced myself I could handle it professionally. Then the comments became more personal, the messages more frequent, and the pressure more obvious whenever I failed to respond the way he wanted. I followed every company policy exactly as written. I submitted reports. I attached screenshots. I provided dates, witnesses, and email records. Yet every conversation with HR ended the same way, with assurances that the matter was being reviewed and subtle warnings that accusations against senior leadership could damage workplace morale. By summer, I realized the investigation wasn't stalled because they lacked evidence. It was stalled because they already knew what the evidence would prove. By August, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Every complaint I submitted seemed to disappear into the same black hole, and every person involved acted as though the situation had already been settled behind closed doors. On August 3rd, I received an email from HR Representative Melissa Grant confirming that my most recent harassment report had been received and would be investigated within 10 business days. 21 business days later, I followed up. The response arrived 12 minutes later. The matter remains under review. Nothing else. No questions. No interviews. No requests for additional information. Just a sentence that looked copied from a template. What frustrated me wasn't the delay itself. It was the confidence with which they expected me to accept it. Around the office, Daniel continued behaving exactly as he always had. During one leadership meeting, he interrupted my presentation, smiled at the executives around the table, and said, "Claire always gets so serious. Someone should remind her that not everything is life or death." The room laughed politely. I smiled and continued speaking. What nobody knew was that I had recorded the date, time, attendees, and context in a spreadsheet I updated every evening before leaving work. Months earlier, I had stopped relying on memory. Facts were harder to dismiss. On September 11th, I submitted my 4th formal complaint. This one included screenshots of messages Daniel had sent after midnight, comments referencing my appearance, and a chain of emails showing he repeatedly requested private meetings unrelated to my job responsibilities. 3 days later, HR scheduled a meeting. I arrived carrying a binder containing every document I had collected since March. Melissa and HR Director Karen Holloway were already seated when I entered. Karen barely glanced at the binder. Instead, she folded her hands and asked whether I had considered how these allegations might affect team cohesion. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. Then she continued. Senior leaders are under tremendous pressure. Sometimes communication styles can be misinterpreted. I remember looking down at the stack of printed messages before responding. Are you saying these messages are appropriate? Karen immediately shifted directions. That's not what I'm saying. But she never answered the question. The meeting ended 42 minutes later with another promise that the investigation would continue. Walking back to my desk, I finally understood something important. HR wasn't gathering facts. They were managing risk. And in their calculation, I was the risk. That realization changed my approach completely. I stopped expecting fairness from internal processes. Instead, I focused on documentation. Every email was saved. Every meeting invitation was archived. Every conversation was summarized and emailed back to participants for written confirmation. When Daniel called unexpectedly, I followed up with detailed notes. When HR requested meetings, I logged timestamps and attendees. I wasn't planning revenge. I was creating a record. Then something unusual happened. On September 26th, a coworker named Ethan approached my desk after most employees had left for the day. He looked uncomfortable, like someone carrying information he wasn't sure he should share. After checking that nobody else was nearby, he quietly said, "You didn't hear this from me, but you're not the only person who filed complaints." I felt my pulse slow instead of speed up. How many? I asked. Ethan hesitated. At least 4 that I know about. 4. For months, HR had treated my reports as isolated incidents, misunderstandings, personality conflicts. Yet suddenly there were others. Other complaints. Other employees. Other records. Ethan didn't stay long. Before leaving, he added one final sentence that stayed with me all weekend. Karen keeps telling people everything is under control. The following Monday morning, an unfamiliar calendar invitation appeared in my inbox. And the names listed on that invitation changed everything. The calendar invitation arrived at 8:14 a.m. on Monday, September 29th, while I was reviewing quarterly operations reports. At first glance, it looked like a routine corporate meeting. Then I noticed the attendee list. My name was there. Daniel Mercer's name was there. HR Director Karen Holloway and Melissa Grant were included as well. So were the Chief Financial Officer, the company's General Counsel, 2 members of the executive leadership team, and a compliance consultant whose name I had never seen before. The meeting title was simple: Executive Compliance Review. No agenda. No explanation. No attachments. Just a mandatory attendance notice scheduled for the following Thursday. Within minutes, whispers began moving through the office. People were checking calendars, forwarding screenshots, and trying to figure out what was happening. Around noon, I passed Karen near the elevators. Normally she carried herself with complete confidence. That day, she looked distracted. She didn't notice me until the last second and immediately looked away. It was a small moment, but after months of watching HR dismiss every concern I raised, the change stood out. By Tuesday afternoon, the atmosphere inside the office felt different. Daniel, who usually spent half his day walking through departments making jokes and drawing attention to himself, stayed inside his office with the door closed. Employees noticed. Nobody said much publicly, but people observe more than management realizes. They noticed when executives stopped smiling. They noticed when meetings were suddenly canceled. They noticed when HR personnel began requesting access to archived records. Then Wednesday morning brought the first real clue. An email was sent company-wide announcing that an external compliance review was underway and that employees might be contacted regarding workplace conduct, reporting procedures, and internal investigations. The message emphasized confidentiality and prohibited retaliation of any kind. I read it 3 times. The wording was careful, but one sentence immediately caught my attention. Employees were encouraged to provide information regarding any unresolved complaints submitted within the previous 36 months. 36 months. That wasn't a review of my case. That was something much larger. Around 4 p.m. that same day, my phone rang. The caller identified herself as Rebecca Shaw, a senior consultant working with an outside compliance firm. She requested a private interview before Thursday's executive meeting. We scheduled it for the next morning. I barely slept that night. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew this was the first time anyone outside the company had asked to hear the full story. Thursday arrived cold and rainy. At 9 a.m., I entered a conference room on the building's top floor where Rebecca was waiting with a laptop and several folders. What happened next felt completely different from every interaction I had experienced with HR. She asked specific questions. She requested dates. She wanted documentation. When I mentioned emails, she asked for copies. When I referenced meetings, she requested attendee names. Every piece of information mattered. Halfway through the interview, she stopped typing and looked directly at me. Did HR ever inform you whether other complaints had been filed involving the same individual? I answered truthfully. No. Rebecca made a note. Then she asked another question. Did anyone from HR discourage you from pursuing your complaint? I thought about Karen asking whether my reports might affect team cohesion. I thought about warnings regarding morale and career consequences. I thought about 7 months of delays. Yes, I said calmly. Multiple times. Rebecca's expression didn't change, but her pen moved much faster. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. Before leaving, I handed her copies of every document I had organized over the previous months. She accepted them without surprise, as though she had expected extensive records. As I stood to leave, she thanked me for maintaining detailed documentation. Then she said something I will never forget. You're considerably more prepared than most people we interview. For the first time since March, I felt completely certain about one thing. Someone was finally looking at the evidence. And evidence has a way of making certain people very uncomfortable. The executive compliance meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m., but by noon the entire building felt like it was holding its breath. Employees moved through the hallways quietly, conversations stopping whenever managers appeared. Even the usual office noise seemed muted. Around 1:15 p.m., I noticed something unusual through the glass walls surrounding the executive conference wing. Several unfamiliar individuals were arriving carrying laptops, document cases, and identification badges from the outside consulting firm. This wasn't a symbolic review. It was a full investigation. At exactly 1:58 p.m., I entered the conference room and took a seat near the far end of the table. Daniel sat across from me. Karen occupied a chair beside the general counsel. Neither looked particularly comfortable. For months they had controlled every conversation. Now neither appeared to know what was coming next. The meeting began promptly. Rebecca Shaw stood at the front of the room and thanked everyone for attending. Then she explained that the compliance review had been initiated after concerns were raised regarding the handling of employee misconduct reports and internal investigation procedures. The room became very quiet. Rebecca wasn't speaking emotionally. She wasn't making accusations. She was simply presenting facts. And facts can be devastating when people have spent months avoiding them. For nearly 40 minutes, she reviewed timelines, reporting procedures, email records, and investigation logs. As she spoke, a large screen displayed dates and documentation. March, April, May, June, July, August, September. My complaints appeared there alongside internal HR communications and response timelines. What immediately became obvious was that the delays weren't random. Certain reports had remained untouched for weeks. Required interviews were never completed. Documentation requests had never been sent. Follow-up procedures outlined in company policy had been ignored. Then Rebecca displayed something that visibly changed the atmosphere in the room. Internal HR emails. The first email had been written by Melissa. The second had been written by Karen. I watched Karen's face lose color as excerpts appeared on the screen. One message discussed minimizing escalation. Another referenced avoiding unnecessary executive attention. A third suggested delaying actions until employee concerns lost momentum. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The words were right there. Timestamped. Archived. Impossible to explain away. Then Rebecca moved to the next section of the presentation. Multiple complaints. My report had not been the only one. Not even close. 5 separate employees had filed concerns involving Daniel over a 2-year period. 5. Each complaint had followed a remarkably similar pattern. Reports submitted. Delays initiated. Investigations stalled. Cases quietly closed. As the timeline expanded across the screen, the pattern became undeniable. For months, HR had presented each complaint as an isolated issue. The records revealed something entirely different. A system. The CFO finally broke the silence. Are you telling us this happened repeatedly? Rebecca answered immediately. The documentation indicates repeated failures to follow company policy across multiple cases. Daniel attempted to respond. I think we're drawing conclusions before reviewing all context. Rebecca calmly clicked to another slide. It contained message screenshots, witness statements, interview summaries, and archived communications collected during the review. The context was reviewed, she replied. Daniel stopped talking. What happened next surprised everyone. The general counsel opened a folder and began asking Karen direct questions about investigation procedures. Unlike previous meetings, there were no vague answers available. Every response was compared against written records. Every statement could be verified. Every discrepancy became visible. By the time the discussion ended, the power dynamics inside the room had completely reversed. The people who had spent months questioning employees were now being questioned themselves. As the meeting concluded, Rebecca informed attendees that the investigation remained active and additional actions would follow based on findings already collected. Employees were dismissed one by one. As I gathered my documents, I noticed Karen staring at the conference table. For 7 months, she had controlled the outcome of every conversation. That afternoon, the evidence was controlling the outcome instead. And the most significant reveal was still waiting to happen. The real fallout began less than 24 hours after the compliance meeting ended. Friday morning, employees arrived to find several executive calendars suddenly blocked with confidential appointments. Rumors spread quickly, but nobody knew exactly what was happening. Around 10:30 a.m., an email from the CEO's office appeared in every inbox. The message announced that an ongoing independent review had identified serious concerns regarding policy enforcement, employee complaint handling, and leadership accountability. It also confirmed that immediate administrative actions had been taken while the investigation continued. No names were mentioned. They didn't need to be. By lunchtime, Daniel's office was empty. His name had disappeared from internal directories. His scheduled meetings were reassigned. His access badge no longer worked. The same afternoon, Karen Holloway was placed on administrative leave pending further review. Melissa Grant followed shortly afterward. The speed of it all felt surreal. For 7 months, every obstacle had seemed permanent. Then, once independent eyes examined the evidence, the structure protecting those obstacles collapsed in less than 2 days. The following week brought even more revelations. Employees who had remained silent for years began speaking with investigators. Additional records surfaced. Archived emails were recovered. Witnesses who had previously declined interviews agreed to participate. The company discovered that multiple complaints had been improperly categorized, delayed, or closed without completing required procedures. In some cases, employees had never been informed their investigations were officially terminated. The findings weren't just embarrassing. They exposed significant legal and financial risks the company had failed to address. On October 17, I received an invitation to meet with the CEO and General Counsel. Unlike the calendar notice that had started everything, this one included a detailed agenda. When I entered the conference room, the atmosphere felt completely different from the meetings I had attended with HR. Nobody questioned my motives. Nobody suggested I was creating conflict. Nobody implied I should have remained quiet. Instead, the CEO thanked me for documenting concerns professionally and consistently despite repeated setbacks. Then he said something I had waited months to hear. You should have been taken seriously the first time. There was no dramatic applause. No movie-style speech. Just accountability. Real accountability. The company announced major changes to its reporting process, hired an independent employee relations firm, implemented external oversight for future investigations, and reopened previously closed complaints for review. Several leadership positions were restructured. New compliance safeguards were introduced. Employees were given direct reporting channels that bypassed internal management entirely. The changes didn't erase what happened, but they prevented the same pattern from repeating. A month later, I received a promotion into a newly created operational compliance role. Ironically, part of my responsibility involved helping ensure employee concerns were documented and addressed appropriately. Some people called it karma. I viewed it differently. Karma suggests events magically balance themselves. What happened here wasn't magic. It was evidence. It was preparation. It was refusing to let frustration replace discipline. The people who underestimated me assumed silence meant weakness. They mistook patience for surrender. What they never understood was that every ignored email, every delayed investigation, every dismissive meeting was creating a record. And records tell stories that opinions can't erase. Looking back, the calendar invitation didn't change everything because it saved me. It changed everything because it forced the truth into a room where nobody could ignore it anymore. The moment facts became visible, excuses stopped working. And for the first time in 7 months, the people who had controlled the narrative lost control of the outcome. 3 years have passed since that October, and every now and then someone asks whether I regret staying as long as I did. The answer is always the same. No. Not because the experience was easy, and certainly not because the months of frustration were worth reliving. I don't regret it because leaving would have allowed the story to end exactly the way certain people wanted. Quietly. Conveniently. Unchallenged. Instead, the truth was documented, examined, and ultimately impossible to dismiss. The people responsible for ignoring legitimate concerns spent months believing they controlled the outcome. What they failed to understand was that power built on silence becomes fragile the moment evidence enters the conversation. Today, when I help employees navigate difficult situations, I often remember those long meetings where I was told to be patient, stay positive, and trust a process that wasn't actually working. Those experiences taught me something valuable. Staying calm doesn't mean accepting mistreatment. Sometimes it means collecting facts while everyone else assumes you've given up. And sometimes the strongest move is simply refusing to disappear. If you've ever stayed silent while people underestimated you, documented the truth while others controlled the narrative, or watched patience succeed where anger failed, subscribe to the channel. Because some stories deserve to be heard all the way to the end.